Chapter 7. Pa remembered something later that night that forced him to come to grips with what he was feeling toward Morgan. They had continued on to Culhaven, anxious to complete their journey, willing to walk all night and another day if need be rather than attempt one moment's sleep in those woods. They had worked their way back to the main pathway, where it ran parallel to the Silver River, and pushed eastward. As they trudged on, nudged forward by apprehension one step, dragged backward by weariness the next, buffeted and tossed, their thoughts strayed like grazing cattle to sweeter pastures, and Pa Ormsford found himself thinking of the soul. That was when he remembered that the legends had it that the power of the sword of Lee was literally two-edged. The sword had been made magic by Alanon in the time of Bryn Ormsford, while the druid was journeying east with the Vale Girl and her would-be protector, Morgan's ancestor, Rowan Lee. The druid had dipped the sword's blade into the forbidden waters of the Haychorn and changed forever its character. It became more than a simple blade. It became a talisman that could withstand even the Maud wraiths. But the magic was like all magics of old. It was both blessing and curse. Its power was addictive, causing the user to become increasingly dependent on it. Bryn Ormsford had recognised the danger, but her warnings to Rowan Lee had gone unheeded. In their final confrontation with the dark magic, it was her own power and years that had saved them and put an end to further need for the magic of the sword. There was no record of what had become of the weapon after, only that it was not required, and therefore not used again. Until now. And now it seemed it might be Pa's obligation to warn Morgan of the danger of further use of the sword's magic. But how was he to do that? Shades. Morgan Lee was his best friend next to Cole, and this newfound magic Pa envied so had just saved their lives. He was knotted up with the guilt and frustration at the jealousy he was feeling. How was he supposed to tell Morgan that he shouldn't use it? It didn't matter that there might be good reason to do so. It still sounded impossibly grudging. Besides, they would need the magic of the Sword of Lee if they encountered any further shadowing, and there was every reason to expect that they would. He'd struggled with his dilemma only briefly. He simply could not ignore his discomfort and the vivid memory of that creature breathing over him. He decided to keep quiet. Perhaps there would be no need to speak out. If there was, he would do so then. He put the matter aside. They talked little that night, and when they did, it was mostly about the shadowing. There was no longer any doubt in their minds that these beings were real. Even Cole did not equivocate when speaking of what it was that had attacked them, but acceptance did not bring enlightenment. The shadowing remained a mystery to them. They did not know where they had come from or why. They did not even know what they were. They had no idea as to the source of their power, though it seemed it must arrive from some form of magic. If these creatures were hunting them, they did not know what they could do about it. They only knew that the old man had been right when he had warned them to be careful. It was just after dawn when they reached Culhaven, emerging aching and sleepy-eyed from the fading night shadows of the forest into the half-light of the new day. Clouds hung across the eastland skies, scraping the treetops as they eased past, blending the dwarf village beneath a grey and wintry cast. The companions stumbled to a halt, stretched, yawned, and looked about. The trees had thinned before them, and there was a gathering of cottages with smoke curling out of stone chimneys, sheds filled with tools and wagons, and small yards with animals staked and penned. Vegetable gardens the size of thumbprints fought to control tiny patches of earth as weeds attacked from everywhere. Everything seemed crammed together. The cottages and sheds, the animals, the gardens and the forest, each on top of the other. Nothing looked cared for. Paint was peeling and chipped. Mortar and stone were cracked. Fences broken and sagging. Animals shaggy and unkempt. And gardens. And the weeds grown so much into each other as to be almost indistinguishable. Women drifted through doors and past windows. Old mostly. Some with laundry to hang, some with cooking to tend. All with the same ragged, untended look. Children played in the yards, on the pathways, and in the roads, as shabby and wild as mountain sheep. Morgan caught Pa and Cole staring and said, "Oh, I forgot the Culhaven you're familiar with is the one you tell about in your stories." "Well, all that's in the past. I know you're tired, but now that you're here, there are things you need to see." They took them down a pathway that led into the village. The housing grew quickly worse. The cottages replaced by shacks and the gardens and animals disappearing entirely. The path became a roadway rutted and pocked from lack of repair, filled with refuse and stones. There were more children here, playing as the others had, and there were more women working at household chores, exchanging a few words now and then with each other and the children, but withdrawn mostly into themselves. They watched guardedly as the three strangers walked past, suspicion and fear mirrored in their eyes. Culhaven, the most beautiful city in the Eastland, the heart and soul of the dwarf nation, Morgan mused quietly. He didn't look at them. I know the stories. It was a sanctuary, an oasis, a haven of gentle souls, a monument of what pride and hard work could accomplish. He shook his head. Well, this is the way it is now. A few of the children came up to them and begged for coins. Morgan shook his head gently, patted one or two and moved past. They turned off into a lane that led down to a stream clogged with trash and sewage. Children walked the banks, poking idly at what flowed past. A walkway took them across to the far bank. The air was fetid with the smell of rotting things. "Where are all the men?" Pa asked. Morgan looked over. "The lucky ones are dead. The rest are in the mines or in work camps. That's why everything looks the way it does. There's no one left in the city but children and old people. And a few women." He stopped walking. "That's how it has been for 50 years. That's how the Federation wants it. Come this way." He led them down a narrow pathway behind a series of cottages that seemed better tended. Their homes were freshly painted, the stone scrubbed, the mortar intact, the gardens and lawns immaculate. Dwarves worked the yards and rooms here as well. Younger women mostly, the task the same, but the result is different from before as night is today. Everything here was bright and new and clean. Morgan took them up a rise to a small park, easing carefully into a stand of fir. "See those?" He pointed to the well-tended cottages. Pa and Cole nodded. "That's where the Federation soldiers and officials garrisoned here live. The younger, stronger dwarf women are forced to work for them. Most are forced to live with them as well." He glanced at them meaningfully. They walked from the park down a hillside that led toward the centre of the community. Shops and businesses replaced homes, and the foot traffic grew thick. The dwarfs they saw here were engaged in selling and buying, but again, They were mostly old and few in number. The streets were clogged with outlanders come to trade. Federation soldiers patrolled everywhere. Morgan stared the brothers down byways where they wouldn't be noticed, pointing out this, indicating that, his voice at once both bitter and ironic. Over there, that's the silver exchange. The dwarves are forced to extract the silver from the mines, kept underground most of the time. You know what that means? Then compelled to sell at Federation prices and turn the better part of the proceeds over to their keepers in the form of taxes. And the animals belong to the Federation as well, on loan supposedly. The dwarves are strictly rationed. Down there, that's the market. All the vegetables and fruits are grown and sold by the dwarves, and the profits of sale disposed of in the same manner as everything else. That's what it's like here. That's what being a protectorate means for these people. He stopped them at the far end of the street. Well back from a ring of onlookers, crowded about a platform on which young dwarf men and women chained and bound were being offered for sale. They stood looking for a moment, and Morgan said, "They sell off the ones that they don't need to do the work." He took them from the business district to a hillside that rose above the city in a broad sweep. The hillside was blackened and stripped of life, a vast smudge against a treeless skyline. It had been terraced once, and what was left of the buttressing poked out of the earth like gravestones. "Do you know what this is?" he asked them softly. They shook their heads. "This is what is left of the Mead Gardens. You know the story. The dwarves built the gardens with special earth hauled in from the farmlands. Earth as black as coal. Every flower known to the races was planted and tended. My father said it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He was here once, when he was a boy." Morgan was quiet a moment as they surveyed the ruin, then said, "The Federation burned the gardens when the city fell. They burned them anew every year so that nothing would ever grow again." As they walked away, veering backward toward the outskirts of the village, Pa asked, "How do you know all this, Morgan? Your father?" Morgan shook his head. "My father hasn't been back since that first visit. I think he prefers not to see what it looks like now, but to remember it as it was. No, I have friends here who tell me what life for the dwarves is like. That part of life I can't see for myself whenever I come over. I haven't told you much about that, have I? Well, it's only been recently, the last half year or so. I'll tell you about it later." They retraced their steps to the poorer section of the village, following a new roadway that was nevertheless as worn and rutted as the others. After a short walk, they turned into a walkway that led up to a rambling stone and wood structure that looked as if once it might have been an inn of some sort. It rose 3 stories and was wrapped by a covered porch, filled with swings and rockers. The yard was bare, but clear of debris and filled with children playing. "A school," Pa guessed aloud. Morgan shook his head. "An orphanage." He led them through the groups of children onto the porch and around to a side door, set well back in the shadows of an alcove. He knocked on the door and waited. When the door opened a crack, he said, "Can you spare a poor man some food?" "Morgan!" The door flew open. An elderly dwarf woman stood in the opening, grey-haired and aproned, her face bluff and squarish, her smile working its way past lines of weariness and disappointment. "Morgan Lee, what a pleasant surprise. How are you, youngster?" "I am my father's pride and joy, as always," Morgan replied with a grin. May we come in? Of course. Since when have you ever needed to ask? The woman stepped aside and ushered them past, hugging Morgan and beaming at Pa and Cole, who smiled back uncertainly. She shut the door behind them and said, So, you would like something to eat, would you? We would gladly give our lives for the opportunity, Morgan declared with a laugh. Granny Elise, these are my friends, Pa and Cole Omsford of Shady Vale. They are temporarily, homeless, he finished. Aren't we all? Granny Elise replied gruffly. She extended a calloused hand to the brothers, who each gripped it in his own. She examined them critically. Been wrestling with bears, have you, Morgan? Morgan touched his face experimentally, tracing the cuts and scrapes. Something worse than that, I'm afraid. The road to Culhaven is not what it once was. Nor is Culhaven. Have a seat, child. You and your friends, I'll bring you a plate of muffins and fruit. There were several long tables with benches in the centre of the rather considerable kitchen, and the three friends chose the nearest and sat. The kitchen was large, but rather dark, and the furnishings were poor. Granny Elise bustled about industriously, providing the promised breakfast in glasses of some sort of extracted juice. I'd offer you milk, but I have to ration what I have for the children, she apologised. They were eating hungrily when a second woman appeared, a dwarf as well, and older still, small and wizened, with a sharp face and quick bird-like movements that never seemed to cease. She crossed the room matter-of-factly on seeing Morgan, who rose at once and gave her a small peck on the cheek. Auntie Jill, Morgan introduced her. Most pleased, she announced in a way that suggested that they might need convincing. She seated herself next to Granny Elise and immediately began to work on some needlepoint she had brought with her into the room, fingers flying. These ladies are mothers to the world, Morgan explained as he returned to his meal. Me included, though. I'm not an orphan like their other charges. They adopted me because I'm irresistibly charming. You beg like the rest of them at the first time we saw you, Morgan Lee, Auntie Jilt snapped, never looking up from her work. That is the only reason we took you in, the only reason we take any of them in. Sisters, though you'd never know it, Morgan quickly went on. Granny Elise is like a goose down comforter, all soft and warm, but Auntie Jill, well, Auntie Jill is more like a stone pellet. Auntie Jill sniffed. Stone lasts a good deal longer than goose down in these times, and both longer still than Highland syrup. Morgan and Granny Elise laughed. Auntie Jill joined in after a moment, and Pa and Cole found themselves smiling as well. It seemed odd to do so, their thoughts still filled with the images of the village and its people, the sounds of the orphan children playing outside, a pointed reminder of how things really stood. But there was something indomitable about these old women, something that transcended the misery and poverty, something that whispered of promise and hope. When breakfast was finished, Granny Elise busied herself at the sink and Auntie Yook departed to check on the children. Morgan whispered, These ladies have been operating the orphanage for almost 30 years. The Federation lets them alone because they help keep the children out from underfoot. Nice, huh? There are hundreds of children with no parents, so the orphanage is always full. When the children are old enough, they are smuggled out. If they are allowed to stay too long, the Federation sends them to the work camp or sells them. Every so often the ladies guess wrong. He shook his head. I don't know how they stand it. I would have gone mad long ago. Granny Elise came back and sat with him. "Has Morgan told you how we met?" she asked the Omsford. "Oh, well, it was quite something. He bought us food and clothes for the children. He gave us money to buy what we could, and he helped guide a dozen children north to be placed with families in the Free Territories." "Oh, for goodness sake, Granny!" Morgan interjected, embarrassed. "Exactly. And he works around the house now and then, when he visits too," she added, ignoring him. "We have become his own private little charity, haven't we, Morgan? That reminds me, here." Morgan reached into his tunic and extracted a small pouch. The contents jingled as he passed it over. "I want to wager a week or so back about some perfume." He winked at the Velman. "Oh, bless you, Morgan." Granny Elise rose and came around to kiss him on the cheek. "You seem quite exhausted, all of you. There are spare beds in the back and plenty of blankets. You can sleep until dinner time." She ushered them from the kitchen to a small room at the rear of the big house, where there were several beds, a wash basin, blankets and towels. Pa glanced around, noticing at once that the windows were shuttered and the curtains were carefully drawn. Granny Elise noticed the look that the Velman exchanged with his brother. "Sometimes my guests don't wish to draw attention to themselves," she said quietly. Her eyes were sharp. "Isn't that the case with you?" Morgan went over and kissed her gently. "Perspective is always, old mother. We'll need a meeting with Steph. Can you take care of it?" Granny Elise looked at him a moment, then nodded wordlessly, kissed him back and slipped from the room. It was twilight when they woke, the shuttered room filled with shadows and silence. Granny Elise appeared, her bluff face gentle and reassuring, slipping through the room on Kat's feet as she touched each and whispered that it was time, before disappearing back the way she had come. Morgan Lee and the Omsford rose to find their clothes clean and fresh-smelling again. Granny Elise had been busy while they slept. While they were dressing, Morgan said, "We'll meet with Steph tonight. He's part of the dwarf resistance, and the resistance has eyes and ears everywhere. If Walker Bow still lives in the Eastland, even in the deepest part of the Anar, Steph will know." He finished pulling on his boots and stood up. "Steph was one of the orphans Granny took in. He's like a son to her. Other than Auntie Yield, he's the only family she has left." They went out from the sleeping room and down the hall to the kitchen. The children had already finished dinner and retired to other rooms on the upper 2 stories, save for a handful of tiny ones that Auntie Yield was in the process of feeding, patiently spooning soup to first one mouth, then the next, and so on until it was time to begin the cycle all over again. She looked up as they entered and nodded wordlessly. Granny Elise sat them down at one of the long tables and brought them plates of food and glasses of harsh ale. From overhead came the sounds of thumping and yelling as the children played. "It is hard to supervise so many when there is only the 2 of us," she apologized, serving Cole a second helping of meat stew. "But the woman we hire to help out never seemed to stay very long." "You were able to get a message to Steph?" Morgan asked quietly. Granny Elise nodded, her smile suddenly sad. "I wish I could see more of that child, Morgan. I worry so about him." They finished their meal and sat quietly in the evening shadows as Granny Elise and Auntie Yield finished with the children and saw them all off to bed. A pair of candles burned on the table where the 3 sat, but the remainder of the room was left dark. The voices upstairs faded away one by one, and the silence deepened. Auntie Yield came back into the kitchen after a time and sat with them. She didn't speak, her sharp face lowered as she concentrated on her needlepoint, her head bobbing slightly. Outside, somewhere a bell rang 3 times and went still. Auntie Yilt looked up briefly. "Federation curfew," she muttered. "No one is allowed out after it sounds." The room went silent again. Granny Elise appeared and worked quietly at the sink. One of the children upstairs began to cry and she went out again. The Omsford and Morgan Lee looked at each other in the room and waited. Then suddenly there was a soft tapping at the kitchen door. 3 taps. Auntie Yilt looked up. Her fingers stilled and waited. The second slipped away. Then the tapping came again. 3 times. A pause. 3 times again. Auntie Yilt rose quickly, walked to the door and latched it and peeked out. Then she opened the door wide for an instant, and a shadowy figure slipped into the room. Auntie Yilt pushed the door closed again. Granny Elise appeared at the same instant from the hall, motioned Morgan and the Omsford brothers to their feet, and led them over to where the stranger stood. "This is Teal," said Granny Elise. "She will take you to Steph." It was hard to tell much of anything about Teal. She was a dwarf, but smaller than most, rather slight, clothed in dark, nondescript forest clothing, including a short cloak and hood. Her features were hidden by a strange leather mask that wrapped the whole of her face, save for her right jaw and her mouth. A glimmer of dusky blonde hair was visible within the covering of the hood. Granny Elise reached up and hugged Morgan. "Be careful, youngster," she cautioned. She smiled, patted Pa and Cole gently on the shoulder, and hastened to the door. She peeked through the curtains for a moment, then nodded. Teal went out through the door without a word. The Omsford and Morgan Lee went with her. Outside they slipped silently along the side of the old house and through a back fence onto a narrow pathway. They followed the pathway to an empty road, then turned right. The mix of cottages and shacks that lined the roadway were dark, their silhouettes ragged and broken against the sky. Teal moved them down the road quickly and onto a patch of fir. She stopped then and dropped into a crouch, motioning them down with her. Moments later, a Federation patrol of 5. They joked and talked among themselves as they passed, unconcerned with any who might hear them. Then their voices faded and they were gone. Teal stood up and they were off again. They stayed on the road for another 100 yards, then turned into the forest. They were on the very edge of the village now, almost due north, and the sounds of insects began to break through the stillness. They slipped along silently through the trees, Teal pausing now and then to listen before continuing on. The smell of wildflowers filled the air, sweet and strong against the reek of garbage. Then Teal stopped at a line of thick brush, pushed the branches aside, reached down to grip a hidden iron ring, and pulled a trapdoor, lifted clear of the earth to reveal a stairway. They felt their way along its walls until they were completely inside and crouched down there in the dark. Teal secured the trapdoor behind them, lit a candle and took the lead once more. The company started down. It was a short descent. The stairs ended after 24 steps and became a tunnel, the walls and ceiling shored by thick wooden beams and pinned by iron bolts. Teal offered no explanation for the tunnel, but simply moved ahead into it. Twice the tunnel branched in several directions, and each time she made her choice without hesitating. It occurred to Pa that if they had to find their way out again without Teal, they probably couldn't do it. The tunnel ended minutes later at an iron door. Teal struck the door sharply with the hilt of a dagger, paused, then struck it twice more. The locks on the other side snapped free, and the door swung open. The dwarf who stood there was no older than they, a stout, muscular fellow, with a shading of beard and long hair, the colour of cinnamon, a face that was scarred all over, and the biggest mace Pa had ever seen strapped across his back. He had the top half of one ear missing and a gold ring dangling from the remainder. "Morgan!" He greeted and embraced the Highlander warmly. A smile brightened his fierce countenance as he pulled the others inside and looked past him to where Pa and Cole stood nervously waiting. "Friends?" "The best," Morgan answered at once. "Steph, this is Pa and Cole Omsford from Shady Val." The dwarf nodded. "You are welcome here, Velman." He broke away from Morgan and reached out to grip their hands. "Come, take a seat. Tell me what brought you here." They were in an underground room filled with stores, boxed, cartoned, crated, and wrapped that surrounded a long table with benches. Steph motioned them onto the benches, then poured each a cup of ale and joined them. Teal took up a position by the door, settling carefully onto a small stool. "Is this where you live now?" Morgan asked, glancing about. "It needs work." Steph's smile wrinkled his rough face. "I live in a lot of places, and they all need work. This one is better than most. Underground, though, like the others. We dwarves all live underground, neither here or in the mines, or even in our graves. Sad state." He hoisted his mug. "Good health to us and misfortune to our enemies," he toasted. They all drank, but Teal, who sat watching. Steph placed his mug back on the table. "Is your father well?" he asked Morgan. The Highlander nodded. "I bought Granny Elise a little something to buy bread with. She worries about you. How long since you've been to see her?" The dwarf's smile dropped away. "It's too dangerous to go just now. See my face?" He pointed, tracing the scars with his finger. "The Federation caught up with me 3 months back." He glanced at Pa and Cole conspiracially. "Morgan, wouldn't know, you see. He hasn't been to see me of late. When he comes to Culhaven, he prefers to see the company of old ladies and children." Morgan ignored him. "What happened, Steph?" The dwarf shrugged. "I got away. Parts of me, at least." He held up his left hand. The last two fingers were missing, sheared off. "Enough of that, Highlander. Leave off. Instead, tell me what brings you east." Morgan started to speak, then took a long look at Teal and stopped. Steph saw the direction his gaze had taken, glanced briefly over his shoulder and said, "Oh yes, Teal. Guess I'll have to talk about it after all." He looked back at Morgan. "I was taken by the Federation while raiding their weapon stores in the main compound in Culhaven. They put me in their prisons to discover what I could tell them. That was where they did this." He touched his face. "Teal was a prisoner in the cell next to mine. What they did to me is nothing compared to what they did to her. They destroyed most of her face and much of her back, punishing her for killing the favourite dog of one of the members of the provisional government quartered in Culhaven. She killed the dog for food. We talked through the walls and came to know each other. One night, less than 2 weeks after I was taken, when it became apparent that the Federation had no further interest in me and I was to be killed, Teal managed to lure the jailer on watch into her cell. She killed him, stole his keys, freed me, and we escaped. We have been together ever since." He paused, his eyes as hard as flint. "Highlander, I think much of you, and you must make your own decision in this matter. But Teal and I, we share everything." There was a long silence. Morgan glanced briefly at Pa and Cole. Pa had been watching Teal closely during Steph's narration. She never moved. There was no expression on her face, nothing mirrored in her eyes. She might have been made of stone. I think we must rely on Steph's judgment in this matter, Pa said quietly, looking to Cole for approval. Cole nodded wordlessly. Morgan stretched his legs beneath the table, reached for his ale mug and took a long drink. He was clearly making up his own mind. Very well, he said finally, but nothing I say must leave this room. You haven't said anything yet, as yet without taking her, Steph declared pointedly and waited. Morgan smiled, then placed the ale mug carefully back on the table. Steph, we need you to help us find someone. A man we think is living somewhere in the deep Shannara. His name is Walker Bow. Steph blinked. Walker Bow, he repeated quietly, and the way he spoke the name indicated he recognised it. My friends, Pa and Cole, are his nephews. Steph looked at the Valeman as if he was seeing them for the first time. Well now, tell me the rest of it. Quickly Morgan related the story of the journey that had brought them to Culhaven, beginning with the Onsford brothers' flight from Varfleet and ending with their battle with the Shadowman at the edge of the Shannara. He told of the old man and his warnings, of the dreams that had come to Pa that summoned him to the Hayshorn, and of his own discovery of the dormant magic of the Sword of Lee. Steph listened to it all without comment. He sat unmoving, his ale forgotten, his face an expressionless mask. When Morgan was finished, Steph grunted and shook his head. Druids and magic and creatures of the night. Highlander, you constantly surprise me. He rose, walked around the table, and stood looking at Teal momentarily. His rough face creased in thought. Then he said, I know of Walker Bow. He shook his head. And? Morgan pressed. He wheeled back slowly. The man scares me. He looked at Pa and Cole. Your uncle, is he? And how long since you've seen him? 10 years? Well, listen close to me then. The Walker Bow I know may not be the uncle you remember. This Walker Bow is more whispered rumour than truth. Very real all the same. Someone that even the things that live out in the darker parts of the land and prey off travellers, wayfarers, strays, and such are said to avoid. He sat down again, took up the ale mug and drank. Morgan Lee and the Onsford looked at one another in silence. At last Pa said, I think we had decided on the matter. Whoever or whatever Walker Bow is now, we share a common bond beyond our kinship, our dreams of Al-Anon. I have to know what my uncle intends to do. Will you help us find him? Steph smiled faintly, unexpectedly. Direct. I like that. He looked at Morgan. I assume he speaks for his brother. Does he speak for you as well, Morgan? Morgan nodded. I see. He studied them for a long moment, lost in thought. Then I will help, he said finally. He paused, judging their reaction. I will take you to Walker Bow, if he can be found. But I will do so for reasons of my own, and you'd best know what they are. His face lowered momentarily into shadow, and the scars seemed like strands of iron mesh pressed against his skin. The Federation has taken your homes from you, from all of you, taken them and made them their own. Well, the Federation has taken more than that from me. It has taken everything. My home, my family, my past, even present. The Federation has destroyed everything that was and is, and left me only what might be. It is the enemy of my life, and I will do anything to see it destroyed. Nothing I do here will accomplish the end in my lifetime. What I do here merely serves to keep me alive, and to give me some small reason to stay that way. I have had enough of that. I want something more. His face lifted, and his eyes were fierce. If there is magic that can be freed from time's chain, if there are druids yet, ghosts or otherwise, able to wield it, then perhaps there are ways of freeing my homeland and my people, ways that have been kept from us all. If we discover those ways, if the knowledge of them passes into our hands, they must be used to help my people and my homeland. He paused. I want your promise on this. There was a long moment of silence as his listeners looked at one another. Then Pa said softly, I am ashamed for the Southland when I see what has happened here. I don't begin to understand it. There is nothing that could justify it. If we discover anything that will give the dwarves back their freedom, we will put it to use. We will, Cole echoed, and Morgan Lee nodded in his agreement as well. Steph took a deep breath. The possibility of being free, just a possibility, is more than the dwarves dare hope for in these times. He placed his thick hands firmly on the table. Then we have a bargain. I will take you to find Walker Bow. Teal and I, for she goes where I go. He glanced at each of them quickly for any sign of disapproval and found none. It will take a day or so to gather up what we need and to make an inquiry or two. I need not remind you, but I will anyway, how difficult and dangerous this journey is likely to be. Go back to Granny's and rest. Teal will take you. When all is in place, I will send word. They rose and the dwarf embraced Morgan, then smiled unexpectedly and slapped him on the back. You and I, Highlander. Let the worst that's out there be weary. He laughed, and the room rang with the sound of it. Teal stood apart from them and watched with eyes like chips of ice.